And that is Delegate Lopez's bill, House Bill 754. We'll hear from Delegate Lopez for 3 minutes, then Patrice Smith, James Dold, Nina DeJong, Sara Cruzan, Jarrett Harper, and Michael Mendoza. We'll hear from all of them. Let me just double check. And then we might have another panel after that. So we'll hear from all of them in the first panel, then we'll take questions. Delegate Lopez, if you'd like, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair Moon, and Judiciary colleagues. For the record, I'm Delegate Leslie Lopez, here to ask for your support for HB 754, which ensures that Maryland uses trauma-informed and age-appropriate approaches when sentencing minors. Under this bill, if the court determines that a minor was a victim of a sex crime or human trafficking up to a year before the date they committed a crime, the court may transfer them to juvenile court for sentencing. We know from our work in this committee that children's brains develop differently than adults, and that exposure to adverse childhood experiences are traumas that can further change the way the brain functions. Nonetheless, children who are victims of sexual abuse who retaliate directly against their abuser have been convicted in adult court and given life sentences for trying to get themselves out of abusive situations. Many of you are familiar with the case of sex trafficking victim Centoya Brown, who was a minor when she killed a man over twice her age who picked her up for sex and then was subsequently sentenced to life in prison. In California, Sara Cruzan, who you'll hear from today, was sentenced to life in prison for killing the man who had started trafficking her when she was just 12 years old. While both of these women were eventually released, they never should have had to endure the adult criminal justice system in the first place, and neither should any child victim of sexual abuse in the state of Maryland. While these victims can claim self-defense in court, Maryland's self-defense precedent does not allow for the unique circumstances that children go through. Children trapped in abusive situations may not have had the luxury of waiting for conditions that provide for self-defense when they attempt to free themselves. For example, they may plan their actions or wait for their abuser to be asleep or otherwise be less dangerous before taking action. And so, in conclusion, minors who are the victims of sexual abuse and human trafficking are some of Maryland's most vulnerable citizens. Rather than using the criminal justice system to punish them when they retaliate against their abusers, Maryland should work to provide them rehabilitative services so that they never are subject to that abuse again. Thank you, and I ask for a favorable report.
Thank you. Let's hear from Patrice Smith, please, for 2 minutes.
Hello, my name is Patrice Smith and I am a survivor. At the age of 16, I was incarcerated for actions committed against my abuser who began sexually abusing me at the age of 15. Upon indictment, I was immediately referred to Supreme County Court to face criminal charges as an adult. I myself had no prior involvement with the justice system and was immediately overwhelmed with trying to understand the process and procedures. I admitted to the court everything I had endured up until that point, and it was not recognized. My case was viciously prosecuted in the media, where I endured ridicule from the county correctional officers as well as other incarcerated individuals. I woke up to public opinion and scrutiny, judgment about the sexual abuse I had endured. The shame I had been holding in increased 1,000 times over. After having been incarcerated for a year, I was found guilty by a jury. This jury was made up of adults who were closer in age to my victim than myself. So how could they understand the thought process of a 15 or 16-year-old when they themselves were so far removed from those golden years? They questioned why I did not tell anyone, but who could I have told? I was ashamed, I was scared, and when you are a child, the loneliness of your pain silences you. I was sentenced to prison for more years than I had been alive. I was given a 25 to life sentence. The court failed to consider the abuse I endured. It failed to establish that as a child, I had the right to be free from that abuse, that I had a right to protect myself. It failed in its duties to conduct a thorough investigation into my life, to consider factors such as violence, peer pressure, mental capacity for making sound choices. I was thrown away. I was made to feel that my life was not valuable, that I somehow should have kept enduring the sexual abuse. I was sent to an adult prison where I struggled with these identities of being a victim and a perpetrator of a crime. I learned to make an abnormal environment normal. I struggled for years to understand why fighting for my life was wrong. Why did I not deserve to be free? Why did what happened to me not matter to anyone? Why was I not considered a victim? All I wanted was for him to stop touching me, stop threatening me, to be able to look at my father and not feel stained, dirty, and unworthy. I'm pleading with you to pass this bill. The protection of our youth has to be a priority. The courts can no longer turn away, because if the world fails them, they should have you to be their defenders, to be their protectors. You alone are tasked with making sure every factor that could have influenced their judgment is considered. You alone are tasked with giving them all the protection that they have lost. It is your duty. This shouldn't be a choice. There should be no fear in wanting to protect our children. In 2020, after having served 21 years and 9 months, I was released in New York under a new law called the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. It was finally acknowledged by the court, all of the abuse I had endured. 21 years, ladies and gentlemen, 21 years. Please do not allow another child to be savagely thrown away and made to feel as if their own life doesn't matter before they even had a chance to live. Thank you.
Ms. Smith. James Dole for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. James Dole for Human Rights for Kids. Want to thank Delegate Lopez for her leadership in introducing this bill. A lot of you know me as CEO and founder of Human Rights for Kids, but I'm also, before I was the founder and CEO, I was a survivor myself. I was a survivor of child labor trafficking and sexual abuse, which is why these issues are so important to us as an organization and why we fight so hard on behalf of child victims. There's two critical components to House Bill 754. The first is the requirement that when children are sentenced in adult court, that their child status actually matters, that judges consider age, trauma history, family background before they impose whatever sentence they're going to impose. So it doesn't restrict the judge in terms of what sentence they can impose. It just says children are different. We need to make sure that we treat them differently in the criminal legal system when they've been convicted in adult court. What we know too from the data, as I've mentioned in my prior testimony on other bills, we see that 48% of children experience roughly 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. That is particularly acute for girls, where 73% of them have been both physically and sexually abused. And the second component of this bill, which is also really important, is the requirement to make sure that when we have child sex crime victims or child trafficking victims who commit offenses against the people who have abused them, and the judge finds that by clear and convincing evidence, that we give judges more discretion in those cases. Ask yourself this one important question, that if Patrice Smith or Sara Jacobs or Jared Harper, who you're going to hear from later today, was your child who had been sexually abused, raped, or trafficked, what would you want done? Wouldn't you want judges in those cases to have as much discretion as possible to potentially send that case back down to juvenile court? Under Maryland's current statute, children charged with first-degree murder cannot be sent down to juvenile court. They have to be sentenced as an adult. And so this exception, making this exception that allows for judges to have that discretion for child sex crime victims, is absolutely essential. And then just one quick word about the amendments. There are 2 amendments with this bill. What they specifically do is they strike the blended sentencing section in subsection C3, which was a concern raised by both the Public Defender's Office and the Maryland Judicial Conference. So it addresses those concerns on that front. And the second, it clarifies subsection C so that it makes clear that that section applies only specifically to child sex crime or human trafficking victims whose offenses were committed against their abusers. And for with that, Mr. Chairman, we would urge this committee's favorable report. Thank you.
Nina DeJong, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the chair and members of this committee for having me. My name is Nina Dunke, and I'm the policy director at ECPAT USA, an organization dedicated to ending the commercial sexual exploitation of children. I also serve on the legislative committee for PG County's Human Trafficking Task Force in Maryland. I come before you today in strong support of HB 754. Too often, children are unfairly prosecuted, sentenced, and incarcerated within the adult criminal justice system. This bill stands to significantly impact outcomes for children who are currently facing the criminal system. It allows judges to consider adverse childhood experiences and trauma. Additionally, the bill would allow judges to send cases of children who are victims of trafficking back to juvenile courts for disposition. This is essential because the criminalization of child sex trafficking victims continues to be an issue. Far too often, the judicial system penalizes minors who are being exploited, and these children become part of the system without any consideration given to the awful abuse they endured as a result of their exploitation. Traffickers leave their victims hopeless and engulfed in fear. Escaping this vicious reality seems nearly impossible for some. Allowing courts the ability to exercise leniency in these cases is vital. Our legal system's inability to view children as victims in these circumstances effectively prevents it from being able to adequately serve vulnerable youth. To be clear, children should not be charged for crimes that occurred as a result of their victimization. I say this with sadness, but if the judicial system is going to continue to criminalize children, then it must be done from a lens and an approach that understands the complexity and trauma and the needs of children who come into the courtroom, which can be done through juvenile court proceedings. Treating children in a trauma-informed and age-appropriate manner is critical to both their psychological and physiological well-being. It is incumbent upon us to do all that we can to ensure children are able to reintegrate into society with the necessary resources and legal support. To conclude, ECPAT USA has a Survivors Council who tells us time and time again that trauma-informed services are essential to helping protect young people who remain at risk. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much. Sara Cruzan, please. Sara Cruzan. Ms.
Okay.
Cruzan, are you operating the
Yes.
vehicle or are you pulled over
No,
on the side
sir.
of the road? Okay,
I am pulled over for sure. Yes, absolutely.
2 minutes.
So, okay. Well, thank you. I've been prepared.
Good, go ahead.
Okay. So, yeah, my name is Sara Jacobs Cruzan, and the majority of my life I was identified as Cruzan W59700 while haunted by horrendous, embarrassing, unspeakable situations I was subjected to by the adults in my life and the community members as well. To this day, I'm in therapy doing my best to make sense of the why behind all of the abuse. Being an invisible voice as an unidentified victim of child sex trafficking for so many years, I found that HB 754 would allow judges the discretion to make decisions based on trauma-informed best practices to enhance the overall wellness of our children who come in contact with our justice system. The vast majority of our children in the justice system are contending with early childhood trauma and unmitigating adverse childhood experiences. I was one of those children. About 90% of the children in the justice system have experienced at least 2 of the 3 adverse childhood experiences, which may include anything from abuses of neglect to having an incarcerated parent or living with a family member who's abused substances. I've experienced 10 out of the 10 adverse childhood experiences. Despite being a victim of child sex trafficking, sex abuse, and rape committed by the man that I did kill, I was tried as an adult where none of the abuse and the complex trauma I experienced through my childhood was admitted into evidence. I had no victims advocate. I had no therapeutic modalities dealing with the trauma. There was no trauma-informed care to offer to me. As a rape victim, I was my only witness. And after 2.5 days of trial, I was ordered to pay a $10,000 victim's restitution and serve a life without parole sentence, plus 4 years. The prosecution, the judge, and the media depicted me as a sophisticated monster, the worst of the worst, and sentenced me as such. The justice system sentenced me to life imprisonment without parole, plus 4 years for killing the man who victimized me for nearly a third of my young life. I was paroled October 31st, 2013. I think because of the fact that we're limited to just 2 minutes and being silenced and feeling invisible, I really feel that, like Nelson Mandela once said, there is no keener revelation of a society soul than the way in which it treats its children. What does it say about our soul then if we allow our children who have been trafficked to be sentenced to decades in prison for having committed crime against their abuser? Children like us deserve to be protected by the system, not traumatized by it, and not to develop a relationship within it that is abusive and more trauma-inducing situations. The legislation before you offers an opportunity to create a system that centers care and not cages for our most vulnerable children. And I ask you in this situation to please meet these children with empathy, compassion, understanding, and love. Thank you.
Thank you. Jarrett Harper, please.
How you guys doing? I would like to express my gratitude for the effort and work it takes each one of you to examine the laws and the recommended needed reforms. My name is Jared Harper. I'm a passionate advocate for criminal justice reform, working for positive change in the foster care system, as well as ending life sentences for children while creating better rehabilitative resources for citizens returning to society. Your time is valuable, and I am encouraged by this invitation to share my personal experience within multiple systems, mainly the California sentencing laws, and express the serious need for reform when it comes to life without the possibility of parole. On June 18, 2019, I was released from prison after serving 20 years in Lancaster State Prison, just right outside of Los Angeles. At the age of 16, myself and a co-defendant and I took the life of a man, and I was convicted of murder. I was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, plus 10 years. I faced a murder trial without the support of anyone but the court-assigned public defender. Caught in the foster care system since infancy, my choice has never felt like my own. So much as like really functioning, like I was really like just functioning, trying to survive. From the age of 6 to 13, I was sexually abused by my neighbor. I had grown to trust him. In an effort to protect myself and my younger brother, I took the life of my abuser. I've learned when we encounter troubling circumstances, we are faced with two options: fall victim or rise above them. In my case, the latter was made possible by the former. In the years of serving my punishment, I developed insight into myself. And in that process, I also developed insight into the harm of other people. And I started to help those people while in prison. And it provided me with just so much insight into myself and into the harm that had took place. And after 20 years of doing self-reflective work and doing self-help programs, on August 17th, 2018, I was released with the support of advocates such as Brian Stevenson, John Legend, Elizabeth Calvin, and so many other countless advocates. My sentence was commuted by Governor Jerry Brown, and I was later released by Governor Newsom out here in California. As I sit before you guys today, sharing my first 39 years of life with you all, it is my mission to continue the work for change within each system that disproportionately traumatized me while influencing those still impacted by harsh sentences to rehabilitate and transform, to be considered safe and whole to come back out into society. I support this bill.
Mr. Harper, I'm sorry, I'm going to need to ask you to begin to wrap up, please.
I support this bill because I know what it's like to not have my trauma looked upon. I know what it's like to be sent to an adult court system without ever being considered. And I just think that it's important that you guys reevaluate the people who are in your prison systems and really look at the trauma that they endured before they committed their crimes. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. We'll hear now from Michael Mendoza, please, for 2 minutes.
Dear Chairman and honorable members of the committee, my name is Michael Mendoza, and I'm the Director of Advocacy with the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, and I thank you for this opportunity to speak in support of this bill. This bill is very important to me because while in the 10th grade, at the age of 15, I made the worst decision of my life and participated by sitting in the backseat of a car during a gang-related murder that unfortunately took the life of another young man. I was immediately arrested and held accountable, as I should have been. I had never been arrested before or in trouble with the law. However, I had never felt so hopeless. Standing before a judge, being tried as an adult, convicted to life in prison, felt as if the whole world had given up on me and I would never go home. Young people in prison, in adult prisons, face sexual, physical, emotional, and mental abuse. Most never make it home. I was more worried about my safety rather than my rehabilitation. But by the grace of God, policy saved my life and allowed me to prove I was no longer that 15-year-old kid anymore. This bill considers the trauma and victimization that happens in a child's life prior to their system involvement. and that children are developmentally different from adults. More importantly, this bill will save lives and make families healthy and whole. For these reasons, the Anti-Recidivism Coalition supports HB 754, and I respectfully urge this committee to issue a favorable report. Thank you.
All right. Other questions for this panel? All right, seeing none, we thank you all very much for your testimony today. And we're going to move to the next panel. We're going to go to Mikhail Gross, Kimberlee Watts, Nicole Hanson-Mundell, please, for 2 minutes each. Ms. Gross?
Yes, can you
Go
hear me?
ahead for 2 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Michal Gross, and I'm an assistant public defender in Southern Maryland, where I represent youth in both juvenile and adult court. I am signed up as favorable with amendments, but the sponsor has already submitted those amendments, as Mr. Dole discussed earlier, and so I'm now testifying in support of HB 754. The brain science tells us that children are different than adults, and trauma only exacerbates those differences. We know that most kids involved in the justice system have been exposed to adverse childhood experiences. Those experiences cause them to react differently to situations that might not seem like a threat to an average kid, let alone an average adult. But the criminal justice system in Maryland treats these children as adults, ignoring the trauma and the experiences that they've been through. Self-defense that was discussed earlier requires a finding that their actions were reasonable, not taking into consideration everything that they've been through beforehand, all of the trauma that they have experienced. And what the criminal justice system does is it doesn't allow them a chance to be treated like the children that they are and get the treatment and care that they deserve. So when you have a 16 or 17-year-old who has already been trafficked, been beaten, been broken by an abusive adult who finally reacts and strikes back against the person who has struck them repeatedly, that 16 or 17-year-old is then incarcerated with adults, charged as if they were an adult, punished as if they were an adult, without consideration for what they've been through, without even the option of transferring their case to juvenile court, even for children as young as 16 years old. If these children only got the help that they're asking for, they could be rehabilitated. The underlying trauma could be addressed and they'd have a chance for a life ahead, instead of the continued sexual abuse, rape, and the suicide-inducing conditions of an adult prison. And my written testimony goes into the statistics behind all of that. When we see a 16 or 17-year-old crying for help, we shouldn't discard them, and instead we should offer them assistance. And so for these reasons, we urge the committee to issue a favorable report, and I'm happy to answer any questions about the logistics of this and how it would work within the juvenile and criminal court system.
Kimberlee Watts, please, for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I'm Kimber Watts. I'm an attorney with the Office of the Public Defender. We ask that you issue a favorable report on this bill as amended. The hallmark of all children, including adolescents, is that their brains are still growing and changing. Those changes continue into early adulthood. Having been teenagers once, most of us will remember it was a time of heightened sensation-seeking and risk-taking behavior, when the opinions of our peers had overblown importance. Over the last 25 years, we've gained a better understanding of the biological basis for these behaviors, but very quickly, the prefrontal cortex and the limbic systems are at odds in adolescence. The prefrontal cortex enables us to intentionally control our emotional responses and impulses and enables us to accurately assess the risks involved in our behavior. And during adolescence, it's weak and underdeveloped. Unfortunately, for kids everywhere, the limbic systems associated with impulsivity and emotion are hyperactive. For example, the amygdala, which reacts to perceived danger, is highly active in kids and overproducing cortisol and adrenaline, resulting in disproportionate fight or flight responses. In other words, at the same time as the part of our brains that tell us how to best handle situations is not functioning all that well, the part that tells us that we are in extreme danger is running on overdrive. To illustrate how this plays out in the real world, I'll use an example of my client, Andrew Zaragoza. This committee previously heard some of his testimony, but to briefly summarize, when Andrew stood up to his sexually abusive mother and told her he was calling Child Protective Services, She stabbed him and he killed her. The state's attorney argued that he went beyond what was necessary for self-defense and he was convicted of second-degree murder at the age of 16. As an adolescent, his amygdala would have been overproducing the cortisol and adrenaline that cause the physical sensations that tell us when we're in danger, while his underdeveloped prefrontal cortex would have had difficulty accurately assessing when the danger was over. So as a 16-year-old and in that moment of panic, Andrew couldn't see the way an older person might
Ms. Watts,
when it was safe to run. And so for these reasons, we ask that you pass this bill or urge a favorable report. Please feel free to contact me with any questions.
thank you very much. Are there questions for this panel? Ms. Hanson-Mundell is not in the waiting room. Seeing none, we thank you all very much for your testimony. Now we'll go to